This happy family man is Bradford King, a former police officer and then a professor of criminology at Western Michigan University. His favorite exercise was asking students to come up with the perfect crime scenario. Yes, the one that could not be solved without the confession of the offender. Of course, the students are criminologists, and for them it was a challenge, and they willingly began to offer their versions of a perfect crime. While teaching at the institute, his life improved. His wife Diane became a popular television presenter. The couple moved into a large country house and raised their second child. But the good time didn't last long. Diane has a crazy admirer who called the house, asked her to dinner, to meet, and once even broke a window and climbed right into the house. But this next thing really scared the couple. A note typed from newspaper headlines, "You must have dinner with me." A year later, Brad found his wife's body in front of the house. The car was nearby with their two children inside. The murder of the TV presenter made a lot of noise and police took up the case. The investigation revealed that sniper fired from nearby stable. They found a .22 caliber shell casing and the gun itself nearby. The family dog picked up the scent but led investigators back to the house in a wide arc. It appeared that offender had made a loop and returned to the crime scene to observe the police. But most importantly, criminologists could not link the bullets from the victim's body to the gun. They were badly deformed and it was impossible to understand anything. The investigation stalled and took an unexpected turn. But before I tell it, let's be those crime students which Brad taught and let's try to understand what it means, the perfect crime. To catch the killer, we'll need the criminologist's help. The crime scene is the very first witness to what happened, but you'll need to make it talk. That's where a forensic expert special toolkit comes in. What's inside? It's easier to say what isn't there. The standard forensic kit includes a hacksaw, pliers, screwdrivers, a compass, a scalpel, a dental excavator, a glass cutter, a spatula, and around 90 tools and chemicals in total. And no, a forensic expert is not required to personally conduct the analysis. That's what the assistants are for. However, they are responsible for collecting the materials. A forensic expert can put on protective suit if needed to avoid getting blood on themselves or leaving traces behind. And they also try to talk less. Why do you think so? Right, to avoid getting saliva on the evidence. A good criminologist is a man with wings. At the crime scene, he hovers above the floor and looks for someone else's footprints, not leaving their own. Every second we give ourselves away, leaving traces. These traces are studied through traceology. This is the section of criminology of traces and moreover of any. These are traces of hands, feet, teeth, and blood, and some remain from the object itself, while others leave only the outline. Even on the moon people left traces, though their study involved a different science. Most important for tracers is the footprints. They can reveal not only the brand of sneakers, but also the person's gender, weight, height, direction of movement, and even unique gait characteristics. If the trace is left on the flat surface, it is photographed and then removed by a special film or device called latent print. If the tracks are on the ground, then they are taken to the lab together with the soil. Then we'll know my height from the footprints. Yes, it's possible. Here is the formula. Here, insert the length of the foot. Here, wide. Multiply the length of the foot by 3.1, the width by 4, and add 53. It is 165. Well, almost 166, so we learned my height. Criminals leave behind not only biological traces, but also marks from their tools. The fewer traces, the calmer and more experienced the criminal was. But some do not bother and bend the door, cut the door, leave or drill the shank. And here is how the padlock breaks in 3 seconds. Tire tracks too can tell a lot. Tire tracks depends on the wear and speed of the car. At 5 miles an hour, the contact spot is a normal square, but at 60 miles, the car is flying. Knowing these techniques, criminals also learn to bypass them. They walk backwards, tying another shoe with the socks back, throw out tools, change tires, change cars. But it's very difficult to get rid of the invisible traces. Smell is the oldest of the senses. Even bacteria have the ability to sense molecules of substances. The smell of each person is unique. It cannot be changed, and it cannot be got rid of. Odorology deals with odors in forensic science. Most reliably, the smell keeps clothes, furniture, and blood. Curling up, it seals the scent. This is called the phenomenon of spilled blood. The victim's blood seals the killer's scent and helps find him. The object with the smell of the criminal is packed in foil, and in the lab, the smell is sealed on a cotton cloth. The smell persists in the freezer for 5 years. Humans can distinguish certain smells, but the dogs can help them identifying. A dog's sense of smell is much stronger than human. Their olfactory system covers about 100 square centimeters, while ours is only about 5. This keen sense isn't limited to a specific breed. Any dog can be trained to detect scents. In training, dogs treat scent detection as a game. Flasks with different fabrics are placed in a circle. The handler and the dog inspects each flask without knowing which one has the target scent. When the dog identifies the correct flask, it signals by freezing. The flasks are then rearranged and the test is repeated. If the dog correctly identifies the scent 3 times in a row, it's considered accurate. Creating devices that detect scent like dogs has been challenging. Simple devices like breathalyzer used by police detect specific substances such as alcohol. However, natural scents are made up of many components, making them harder to replicate in devices. To avoid detection by scent-tracking dogs, criminals have tried various tricks. They scatter food like sausages, use air fresheners to mask their scent, or swim across a river to disrupt the trail. These methods have been used for centuries to try to outsmart tracking dogs. But on larger piece of evidence, there are other traces left by criminals' body, which you can't just label with a sticker. Biological traces, by the way, were not considered at all until about 100 years ago, when Dr. Edmund Lockhart, often called the French Sherlock Holmes, formulated the main principle of forensic science. Every contact leaves a trace. Wherever you go, wherever you interact with, you will always leave something behind and take something with you. At a microscopic level, each of us is like a walking pig pen, shading about 50 million skin cells a day. For DNA analysis, it takes only 8 to 16 cells, less than even a speck of dust. Let's not forget about hairs, tiny droplets of saliva from the mouth, or sweat and oil residues left by palms. But the biggest risk for criminals is if they suffer from dandruff. Once, Head & Shoulders cleverly referenced this in an ad by showing a newspaper clipping about a real court case. A robber named Andrew Pearson left behind a mask containing 25 flasks of dandruff, and they were used to identify him 11 years later. Studies have shown that the required amount of DNA for analysis is just 30 nanograms, which can be obtained from 1 milligram of dandruff. Even standing still, like me, you're scattering your DNA. People are 99.9% the same, but it's the remaining 0.1 that makes us unique. That's what you look like in gene language. These lines are you. The biomaterial needs to be packed and picked up as quickly as possible. It could be a hair or a microscopic piece of skin. Then, in the lab, the reagent destroys the cell and releases the DNA from the shackles. The material is scanned by the device and the result is compared with other samples. DNA can tell your gender, ethnicity, blood type, and if it's in the database, then the specific person. Psychiatrist Cesar Lombroso in the 19th century said that criminals are born, not made. Geneticists can partially agree with him. Yes, there can be aggression in a person, but who he becomes depends on the environment and his decision. Most skin particles are invisible to the naked eye, so experts take cotton swabs moistened with sterile water to collect samples from the places the criminal might have touched. After collection, the samples are left to dry and then placed in a cold environment, stored in a paper bags and never in plastics, as mold could develop. You see, criminologists often work with minimal amounts of biological material collected with a swab at the crime scene. To extract enough DNA, the material needs to be cloned using the PCR method. You might remember this term from the pandemic, PCR, or polymerase chain reaction. PCR is the workhorse of DNA analysis. By comparing DNA samples from a crime scene with those of a suspect, investigators examine regions where specific letter sequence A, T, C, and G are repeated. The number of repeats varies among individuals, making it possible to match or exclude suspects. This method has been used to solve many cold cases. By extracting DNA from old evidence and comparing it against databases, even if the criminal isn't in the system, their relative might be, and it's enough. For example, the original Night Stalker, who murdered at least 13 people, evaded capture for 40 years. But when partial matches to his DNA were found in a commercial genealogy database, they led to his relatives and eventually to the killer himself, Joseph D'Angelo. Here he is, an unrepentant old man, sitting in court, visibly unhappy with modern technology. The likelihood of two people having the same DNA profile is 1 in quadrillion, essentially 0, unless they're identical twins. Identical twins are born from a single fertilized egg, resulting in completely identical DNA. In one case, Tyrone and Jerome Cooper were identical twins, and one of them raped a student, leaving DNA behind. But DNA analysis couldn't determine which twin was responsible. Convicting both would be illegal, so the case remains unsolved. Who do you think the culprit was, Tyrone or Jerome? Leave your comments below. Interestingly, even identical twins have unique fingerprints. It is considered that every human that ever lived on Earth has unique fingerprints. A fingerprint consists of unique patterns, including minutia point where the ridges end or branch. These are manually matched against database prints. If fingerprints are found at the crime scene, DNA containing cells can even be collected directly from those prints. And as you probably know, fingerprinting studies them. They are easy to leave, easy to detect, and difficult to remove. They are formed before our birth, in the 3rd month of pregnancy. Now we are unlocking smartphones with our fingers, but the idea is 150 years old. Here is William Herschel, working in colonial India. He noticed that the locals put signatures indiscriminately and do not feel obligated to do what was promised. Just like we do when we sign the user agreement. Don't tell me you read them. So Herschel came up with a clever move. He made the Indians put a fingerprint under his signature. They thought the print was sacred and therefore they began to perform what they signed up for. And so Herschel changed the game. Each print is a set of patterns, waves or arcs, loops or curls. This set distinguishes some prints from others, and the ratio of patterns differs between nations. Okay, so all you have to do to go unnoticed is remove your fingerprints, right? And believe me, you and I are not the first to think about it. This sweet woman is Ma Barker, one of the most wanted gangsters of the 30s. When her son and his lover were on the run, they asked Joseph Moran, an alcoholic who treated bandits, to get rid of the patterns on their fingers. The doctor cut their skin off their fingers, and Ma Barker relieved them with morphine. But the suffering was in vain because the new skin which grew back had the same papillary lines. Disgruntled, bandits took Moran, who was in a drunken state, and drowned him in Lake Michigan. This is the story. Too bad they didn't know that fingerprints themselves change with time. Now let me show you something really funny. What do you think this is? A child's doodle? A cartoon sketch? No, it's actually the worst sketch ever. But the funny thing isn't that, it's the fact that it really helped identify the perpetrator. Huang Phog Nguyen was stealing money at the mall. It's hilarious, yeah. But the basic facial features are conveyed correctly. Direct mouth, eyes in a bunch, and most importantly, frightened glance. with testimony of witnesses and mugshots deal habitoscopy. Perhaps the most replicated identikit, of course, are the dead or alive posters from the Wild West. Back then, they didn't even need to describe the criminal. It was enough to offer a good reward for the capture, and then things would unfold from there. But have you ever wondered who pays for it? It's so much money. The criminals themselves pay. Ever heard of someone's cousin being released on bail? Now, if he runs away after that, the bond is forfeited and bounty hunters are hired. This way, the state doesn't spend taxpayers' money to catch the criminal. Instead, the criminals pay for their own search, and sometimes they even pay for their own murder. But nowadays, criminals are not identified by drawings. The experts create a portrait using cards or tapes. You take mustache number 1, you put on nose number 3, and eyes on number 5. And you get the dude you're looking for. The easiest way to do this is in the Faces program. We're looking for clear eyes, straight nose, lips and chin, and finally long hair. Found out, huh? It's Jesus Christ. That's how Catholics describes it. And here is African Jesus, described by Africans. Heaven and earth. Okay, what do I mean is, the fact that we have different images of the same person in our minds, and witnesses in a state of passion are often unable to remember all the details. In addition, the offender may wear glasses, mustache, beard, or just a mask. But let me tell you a story. In 1929, when Al Capone's men dressed as policemen, 7 members of Morgan's gang were shot dead. There were many bullets and shell casing left at the crime scene. The culprits would never have been found if it hadn't been for the bullets. They were fired from a .45 caliber Thompson submachine gun. But almost every gang had one, so how could they determine which gang it was with only bullet and shell casing? Let me tell you, firearm study is called ballistics. The main task is to understand what and how the shots were fired. Bullets, shell casing, and holes act as photographs of the event. From the entrance hole, we can trace an imaginary line that shows the trajectory of the shot. Additionally, gunpowder gases can help determine the distance from which the shot was fired. The closer it gets, the more soot it leaves. Here is a point-blank shot, and here is from a distance of a meter. And here, pay attention to the incisions. These grooves are individual seal of the barrel. From a smooth-bore weapon, the bullet flies unevenly, turns from side to side, and it's always losing and bending. Rifled weapons are different. The bullet starts spinning in the barrel, and this rotation prevents it from swinging from side to side. Found bullets rotate 360 degrees and take pictures. Now experts find the weapon and shoot into the bullet catcher. And then they compare the pattern of the bullet they found at the crime scene. If they match, that's it. Weapons have been found. Thompson guns which were found in the possession of Al Capone gang left the same pattern as the bullet at the crime scene. So experts were able to put killers in jail. Surprisingly, it's the first time when rifled weapons contribute to put killers in jail. That's it. All the criminologists realize now you can also catch criminals with ballistics help. And yeah, this is the first case. Since then, criminals are trying to, as soon as possible, throw off their weapons or make cuts on the bullets. As I said before, according to Lockhart's exchange principle, a perpetrator always brings something to a crime scene and takes something away. When a gun is fired, it leaves not only the bullet and shell casing, but also traces of gunpowder and metals like lead and barium, which settles on everything nearby, including the shooter's clothes, hands, and even ears. A shower won't wash them away. These particles are analyzed using an electron microscope to examine particles as small as 10 micrometers, and a spectrometer to identify their chemical composition. This reminds me of movies. A criminal decided to clean up the crime scene properly, not just wiping down with a damp cloth, but using proper cleaning agents. Even blood, invisible under a lamp, could be uncovered. A solution of luminol mixed with hydrogen peroxide reacts with iron in blood, oxidizing it and making it glow brightly in the dark. This technique can reveal even the most thoroughly wiped bloodstains, as in the case of sex worker Lynette White, who was brutally murdered in 1988. Suspects were initially found and convicted, but years later, criminologists re-examined the apartment using luminol and discovered the blood of the actual perpetrator, her client. This was 11 years after the crime. Even though the apartment had been cleaned hundreds of times, the luminol revealed the truth. Here is something amazing to consider. Luminol can even detect traces of blood outdoors after rain. Scientists conducted experiments and found that blood could still be detected in soil 6 years after it was spilled. In a liter of water, luminol can detect just 1 microliter of dissolved blood. 17-year-old Crystal Bislanovich was murdered in Utah in 1995, and the killer seemed to leave no DNA behind. But in 2013, criminologists managed to extract DNA from a rock used as murder weapon. They used a special micro-vacuum to literally suck out the perpetrator's DNA from tiny pores in the rock. A vacuum cleaner in the service of forensic science. Such tools help gather evidence that isn't always visible under ultraviolet light. Those clues may not contain DNA but can hint at the perpetrator's identity. Soil particles from their shoes, fibers from their carpet, or pet hair can all be collected with tweezers or a vacuum. Even pollen and spores from the victim's clothes, examined under a microscope, can reveal the victim's final location. For example, the killer of 14-year-old Leon Turnen was identified because pollen on her body didn't match the plants in the forest where her body was found, but matched those in the garden of her neighbor, John Taylor. He turned out to be the killer, and a serial one at that. Remember the perfect crime from the beginning of the video? A police officer and his wife TV presenter. I think it's time to tell you about him and how the whole story ended. FBI decided to study anonymous letter 10 months after killings. Such notes are left by those whose handwriting can be identified. This suggests that the killer was well acquainted with the victim and carelessly passed the letter just as an attempt to confuse the investigation. And anyone who knew victim well knew criminology. So the killer was her husband and policeman Bradford King. It turned out that he cheated on his wife and constantly dated with students. Then they remembered that during the calls he was never around, and even later, in one of the houses next door, they found the real gun. No wonder Brad asked students to come up with the perfect crime. They helped kill his wife. They advised to imitate the behavior of a maniac, running across the pond and then back to the crime scene, and in another work, a student advised planting a second weapon at the crime scene, which would be impossible to prove. But even an experienced criminologist could not foresee everything, and despite the fact that prosecution was based on circumstantial evidence, Brad King was convicted of first-degree murder and sentenced to life in prison. He is currently alive and continues to remain in prison, having never admitted to his guilt. Any ideal crime ceases to be such when it's solved by criminologists. But there is one case which is very grassroots and it's considered the most ideal, the case of D.B. Cooper. In 1971 he hijacked a plane, received a ransom of $200,000 for the passengers, let them go, took off with the plane and calmly jumped with a parachute, leaving the pilots alone. In 40 years of investigation he was never found. All that is left is a sketch. So I think we all love villains. Thank you and see you next video.